Good morning, Marcel.
Good morning, Ryan. Well, thanks a lot for getting up so early for us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So what's the time there now? Like 6 a.m. or?
6:15, yeah.
Okay. Wow.
At 7, the baby's going to wake up and scream, so you'll have to live with that. But
Okay.
he, he's basically like setting a clock. It's 7, like 5 of 7 to 5 past 7. Snap your fingers, he's up. Yeah, I didn't used to be a morning person, but he's cured me of that.
Yeah, it does change one's habit, doesn't it?
But the good thing is I'm not really up all that much earlier than I would be anyway.
So let's maybe wait a couple more
Yep,
minutes.
no problem. I didn't make too many slides. I figured you all have the paper anyway, so I just kind of gave some key slides for some key diagrams to kind of, get our teeth into it a little bit more rather than trying to do the whole paper as slides.
I think that'll be useful, yes. So will this be a part of your thesis?
Yes. So this is in a way the kind of first chapter of my thesis.
All right. And then you'll also be talking about fundamentality or...
Yes, that's right.
Mhm.
And really from here, I mean, the rest of the thesis is really philosophy of physics, um, in a pretty serious way. But at the beginning, I want to kind of set up the general question about levels and how that relates to certain metaphysical considerations and stuff like that, so that I can then dive into the physics and see, okay, this is how we see this in the physics. But I think it's really interesting to talk about the biology side because a lot of the existing literature on levels is really biologically focused. So a lot of the kind of more general discussion, um, in kind of general philosophy of science is taking place with biological examples. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about it on that terrain, since that's not my area and not my background. So
Right. So I think with that, um, we've already done a little bit of stage setting
fair enough.
for your presentation. So why don't you start?
All righty, let me all right, beautiful. Okay, well, thanks again, Marcel, and all of you for having me join you. Since I'm not really a philosopher of biology, but I'm kind of dabbling outside my area. And thank you also for any of you who had a chance to read the full paper. Certainly appreciate any comments you have on it, either now or any you'd like to send me, since this is part of my dissertation. And as I said, I'm not a philosopher of biology, so especially anything with the biology stuff that's discussed would be super helpful. Or any just thoughts that you have on levels as from the perspective of people who are working more on biology. Anyway, the backdrop, I suppose, is that quite a lot of science textbooks have a diagram kind of like the one you're looking at, some kind of general notion of levels. Often they're kind of listed like this, as dividing up the sciences. And so, if you just open, I guess I don't know what the French ones are like, but an American, just basic intro to college biology textbook that you know, um, first year college student would have for their course. And you'll often get very early a diagram like this, that's attempting to kind of locate what the work we're doing within the other sciences, right? So would say, look, there's different sciences, for example, physics, chemistry, biochemistry, biology, psychology. Um, and biology kind of slots in, at a certain point. So if biology is the study of organisms, that's going to rely on certain other things like biochemistry, chemistry, and physics, such that those studies are going to be relevant to organisms. So, we have, well, diagrams like, studies like biophysics, right, that would tell us, like, might help us solve certain biological questions. Why does an elephant have such big ears? Well, if we know that the ability to hold heat goes up as the cube, but the ability to shed heat only goes up as the square because it's the surface area of the animal, well, then we know that a large animal is going to need to get rid of a lot of heat, especially in a hot climate. Oh, so we need some way to radiate that heat. Look, a big surface that's covered with blood vessels like an elephant's ear. Great. That the reason that elephants' ears are so big is, follows kind of from physics if the elephant's gonna thermoregulate. And, of course, in general, biologists are more and more interested in, chemical mechanisms, the field of biochemistry, right? To understand, biological explanations are more and more being given at the level of the mechanisms in chemistry and biochemistry. Okay, if this is, the genetic effect we're seeing, what's actually, mediating that in terms of the copying of the DNA or the expression of the DNA or, whatever the case might be, or protein folding, at any of a million examples that you can come up with. And so part of the point of this diagram is to maybe justify to the students starting biology why they're going to have to study a lot of chemistry, because maybe that's not something they did in high school or were interested in. They thought, well, I didn't become a chemistry major. I don't really care about chemistry. And now they're kind of being prepared for the rude shock of why they're going to need to talk about chemistry a lot, even if they don't like that. Similarly, many psychology and social science majors, especially in the US, will be required to take a biology class. And so they may be sitting in that room wondering, kind of the inverse question. Well, I really, I'm a psychology major. I came to study, addiction or something like that. Why do I need to study biology? I just want to go help people and talk to them about their addictions. That's what I'm training to do. Why do I need to study biology? And so this is supposed to kind of reinforce that idea too, right? Well, okay, actually, addiction we might think of as being a psychological concern, right? It's something that you might see a psychological counselor or doctor about. But, obviously there are biological roots to addiction. So certain people are predisposed to addiction through biology. There'd be biological mechanisms why addictions are easy to come by and hard to break, all this kind of thing. Biological processes, neurotransmitters and stuff by which addictions are reinforced, by which anti-addiction medications, methadone or whatever might work. If you want to know why you would give methadone to a heroin addict, well, it's precisely because of biology and the neurotransmitters in the brain and, what's fitting with what and what's blocking what. And so that this sort of diagram justifies why a student like that might need to take a biology class. So those are just some of the uses to which they're put. Within biology, ecologists seem particularly attracted to levels diagrams. Just if you look through textbooks from different biology subdisciplines, you see a ton of these diagrams in ecology books. Often they have more additional layers slotted in. You might see something like populations or ecosystems stuck in between biology and psychology somewhere. Or maybe they'll drop psychology and just have populations and ecosystems in between biology and the social sciences. And so there, I suppose the idea is particularly supposed to be on the way that for an ecologist, there are often going to be constraints coming from the lower level, right? So if you think about why different organisms are in the ecological niches that they are, perhaps that will have to do partly with their ability to make use of certain chemical resources, right? So, the nitrogen cycle or something like that will tell you why we need certain bacteria in our ecosystem because they're going to be fixing nitrogen for us. Without that, we won't have, plant growth. Or might help to explain, why many larger animals have lots of gut bacteria, right? Because why are those part of the ecosystem? Why are all bacteria not bad bacteria, so to speak? Why are all host situations not kind of infections or things to think are bad for the organism? Well, because of the availability of resources, of chemical resources, right, from food that they make available. They're digesting things that our guts could not digest on our own without those partner organisms. So that's something that obviously an ecologist would be thinking about. But then at the other end, as you kind of go up the stack, right, the way for an ecologist, we're never going to think just about an individual organism, right? We're going to think about populations of organisms. So the particular biochemical pathways or whatever are always going to be taking place within an organism. So that would be at one level, but then we're going to see the way that a whole population of organisms affect each other, right? The way that different organisms within a population are going to compete for food and mates and things like that. And then the way, of course, that those organisms fit within an ecosystem. So just as a quick example, when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the US, they found that the ecosystem changed dramatically very quickly. Why? Well, there are large herbivores in that ecosystem, bison, and large goats and sheep, mountain sheep and things like that, antelope, or not antelope, elk, deer, etc. And previously they had no predators when wolves had been, as in Switzerland, kind of driven out to the far reaches of the world. And because they had no predators, they grazed, very slowly and very kind of completely. And so they were able to, those large herbivores kind of kept those populations, because of their size, really kept the area as grassland, kept any kind of tree growth from occurring, because they would kind of go back through that grass so often that you wouldn't get any tree growth. But then even the presence of a very few apex predators, those wolves, even though there were only very few wolves in the beginning, and they were only killing, a tiny fraction of those very large herbivore populations. So they weren't really affecting the population size yet, but they were forcing those herbivores to move more quickly. The herbivores, because they're wary of predators, were kind of staying on the move, staying together, moving as a larger pack. And that made their grazing much less complete. They weren't kind of clearing out an area the way they had been. And that meant you started to get very quickly tree growth in areas that hadn't had trees, because they weren't keeping up with all those seedlings. And then, tree growth on riverbanks, you started having refocusing of the river courses, so you see how the addition of one more kind of animal within an ecosystem could quickly affect the ecosystem as a whole at that higher level, even without really affecting the population numbers very much, that we might have thought were the kind of basic make of the ecosystem. We have thousands and thousands of these herbivores. We literally at the beginning had 3 or 4 wolves. So you would think, well, the population level hasn't really changed much, but yet the introduction of a new element to the ecosystem, a new population of the ecosystem, still changed the ecosystem a lot. So that's, I think, a reason that ecologists are so interested in maybe in this levels concept. So this is a thing that's put to a lot of use. At the beginning of the paper, I kind of cataloged a lot of the uses that philosophers of science have put to it. Both philosophers of science of a more reductionist and a more emergentist persuasion. But it's got a lot of use, I think, within biology itself as well, both to justify the kind of way biology as a whole relates to other studies, that other studies are important. They're talking about the parts or pathways or wholes that biological systems make up. And also says something about biologists' own practice, especially for ecologists, and what they're worried about, and what the things they need to keep in mind to make sense of what they work on. But it's been surprisingly difficult to kind of make this concept kind of philosophically tight. So there's been some concerns about levels. And I think the biggest critic has been Angela Potochnik. So she thinks that the levels, to sort of make sense, the levels concept needs to do a few things. So what you have here is a mereology diagram. So for those of you who are obviously philosophy biology and maybe don't worry about parthood all day long like Claudio and I do, let me just kind of introduce what's going on here. So this is intended to be a completely arbitrary parthood diagram. It doesn't represent the parts of any particular organism or thing. And the idea is that the arrows point down from a whole to a part. So 30 is the top whole. Maybe it's the whole cosmos or whole ecosystem, some kind of big top level whole. It's got parts. namely 10, 15, and 6. Maybe those are organisms making up that ecosystem, or maybe they're populations. There's been some literature in philosophy of biology to support this, talking about populations as individuals or species as individuals somehow, that a species is not just a group, but rather it has some kind of real unity, that we can talk about it as an element. And then, of course, but if you ask what a species is, well, of course, the species just, has all of its parts, the organisms, that exist of that species. So, they would be its parts, and then, of course, those organisms have parts, right, et cetera, all the way down. And this is because this is just a totally arbitrary parthood diagram. Again, that doesn't represent any real system. It's just kind of the arrows that will just show that many things are possible. So in general, you can have parts don't always kind of go right into levels. So Potochnik or don't go like immediately into lower levels. So one example Potochnik likes to give is a sodium ion. So she would say that sodium, obviously, it's a super common element in biological systems, and that it's often present, in some larger structure, right? Maybe that sodium is part of an organelle doing a certain work in the cell or something like that. But it could also just be free within the cell membrane, right? And not part of an organelle, in which case it's operating seemingly at a higher level. Like the cell has organelles, but that sodium ion, that chemical reality, is not living then one layer further down, within that organelle. It's just living, free within the cell. Or, in the case of animals like us with circulating blood, you might have, a sodium ion that's just free in the bloodstream, right? And so it's not being carted around by any cell, right? It's not within one of your blood cells. It's just free in the bloodstream, and so it seems like it's an immediate proper part of the organism. So that's why we have curves like the one from 30 down to 5, saying that, okay, normally when we would think about 30's parts, we would list 10, 15, and 6. It seems they're kind of like one level down, but actually it might have other parts that are not actually parts of any of those kind of big parts that are kind of separate. And you might have parts that seem like they're part of more than one whole even. So obviously examples in biology of this are sometimes with symbiotic organisms. They can have parts that don't clearly belong to one or the other, or things like situations like that. So conjoined twins, other biological examples where it seems like maybe parts are actually shared between organisms. If you two conjoined twins, we generally think of them as being separate organisms. After all, in many cases they can be separated and both survive, right? Both have their own thoughts, etc. So we would say they're two organisms, but they might actually, share a kidney or something like that. And part of the separation process, if they took them to the surgeon, would be actually to to give a donor kidney so that they would each have a kidney, post-separation. So they might share a kidney before separation. So that'd be an example of like one there where it's a part of multiple wholes. So Potochnik, says, okay, so you've got this kind of complicated parthood structure, and we think in general, given the considerations that I just had from the last slide, that parthood is going to have something to do with levels, right? We want the parts of things to be at a lower level than the thing, right? Just those examples that everybody's using, like in ecology, the parts of the population are the organisms, so well they had better be at a lower level than the population, and the parts of the organisms are, the organs, parts of the organs, are the tissues, parts of the tissues are the cells, parts of the cells are the organelles or whatever, parts of the organelles are various biological molecules, parts of those biological molecules are atoms, parts of those atoms are subatomic particles. And so we should think that the levels would somehow break down and follow parthood. So what these red lines are supposed to indicate are sort of the levels of this system, that somehow we're trying to take this parthood diagram, which is sort of arbitrarily complex, and kind of carve it into levels. And Potochnik says that the level's language needs to do three things in order to really kind of live up to its billing. One is it needs to provide a grouping principle. So it needs to tell you kind of what's on the same level, collect some things and say all this stuff goes at the same level. It needs to provide a dividing principle, some way of saying that stuff doesn't go at the same level. That stuff should go at only at an adjacent level. And it should provide an ordering principle, some way of telling you which level is the higher one and which level is the lower one. Potochnik is quite critical about whether this can really be done in any kind of systematic way. Why? Well, one example we have is kind of this sodium ion. So she would say, well, okay, what are we supposed to group it with? If we group it as just a part of the organism as a whole, then what happens as soon as it moves inside a cell? We would normally say it's the same sodium ion that's in the blood and now, has moved through the cell membrane, right? That's useful explaining all kinds of biological processes, right? Why, say, you could have a cell lyse if it got too much sodium in it, or how regulation of ions in the blood works. So we would think it's the same sodium ion moving, in and out of the cell. So which level do you put that sodium ion? Is it supposed to be just a part of the organism on the same level as the cell? Or is it supposed to be a part of the cell? If it's a part of the cell, well, then how does that work when it goes outside and it's not part of any cell? Seems like it's changed levels, even though it's the same object. She's also worried about cases where things seem to be, it's not clear kind of where to group things. So for instance, I mentioned earlier about the idea of say, a human symbiotic bacteria, right? We have, as famously, more bacterial cells in our guts than we do bodily cells in our body, somatic cells in our body, which is kind of crazy. And where do we put those? Well, an evolutionary biologist might want to put those bacteria at the same level as us, right? After all, we're both organisms, we both have populations, we both form species. And so you might think we and our bacteria are both entities at the same level, both organisms that fit into species, fill ecosystem niches, have evolved evolutionary histories, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, a biologist who's interested in kind of more causal kind of stories might want to think that what kind of goes at the same level of us is not on individual bacterium, which after all is very small and insignificant, but rather a whole population of bacteria, or maybe even our whole gut flora together. Why? Well, if I'm talking about interactions between bacteria and a mammal, and that mammalian immune system, right, the bacteria is going to be at the same level as a particular immune cell, right? It's going to trigger a particular mast cell at an immune response, or it's going to be eaten by consumed by a single macrophage, right, to take it out of the body. And so those interactions are going to seem to be not the bacterium with me as a whole, but the bacterium with a particular cell that I have. And so we would think maybe the bacterium should be grouped at the single cell level. After all, it's a single cell. It's interacting with my single cells. And we would think that's the right level to put it at. So again, Potochnik is worried that where we put something would depend on what our interests are, right? Are we approaching this as an evolutionary biologist, or somebody's interested in classification or something like that? In which case, well, bacteria are organisms. Or are we approaching this at the level of a biologist who's working on immune processes, say? In which case we would think of them as being just cells and therefore at the same level as our cells, even though those cells, our somatic cells, of course, are not organisms. So I guess maybe concern is too strong. It's not that she thinks this is a bad thing. It's just that she thinks that we then have to realize that the levels concept is not going to be directly like a metaphysical concept. It's not just telling us kind of how the world is divided in some kind of absolute or objective way, but rather it's going to be a concept that's really relative to our own interests and representations. So it's going to be, she uses these tools kind of, these concepts kind of interchangeably, maybe in a way that's confusing, but sometimes she'll say it's just representational, or it's just conceptual, or it's just a model, or it's just interest dependent, or something like that. So she's not trying to talk biologists out of using these concepts, but she's saying they don't really give us any guide to metaphysics. In other words, when we look at this diagram, we should just think of it as a tool for teaching about introductory students, and we shouldn't take it seriously as a kind of description about how the world is structured as philosophers. So that's kind of her concern in particular with levels concepts, and why she doesn't think we should take them seriously as metaphysicians. All right, so then the other kind of major figure working on levels today, this is not part of the paper, but I wanted to put this slide up because somebody who's done a lot of work on biologically relevant levels is Carl Gillett, and he's particularly interested in physiology, and he thinks that physiologists particularly need a levels concept because of the kinds of explanations they give. So he says, for instance, if you want to know how an organism moves, first you're going to give an explanation at a kind of high level of, well, there's muscles contracting, right? And so this muscle contracts and it's going to pull on these tendons, and therefore the leg is going to bend. And then if you want to know, if you ask, well, how does that happen? What makes that work? Then you're going to zoom in and look at the way that muscle fibers kind of walk against each other. There's this sorry, I should have put this as a picture on the slide, but it's kind of a cool fact that there's like they really almost have this like walking. There's like a set of like latches in one of the fibers, and the fiber that's adjacent to it kind of pulls down on those latches, almost like say a person walking on an unpowered treadmill. There's kind of like a friction between the two because of these kind of bumps that stick out that allows the one muscle fiber to kind of walk along the other one, and that's how muscles contract. And then if you ask, well, how does that happen? I mean, okay, that's a nice story at the level of the fiber, but surely there's got to be some biochemical story, right? Then you'll zoom in further and see what those things are made of biochemically, and therefore how they succeed at latching, why they then curve in order to kind of pull the other fiber down, how they unlatch in order to kind of take the next step, so to speak. You're going to give a biochemical story about all those things. And then if you want to know about the energy and activation levels for those things, why does it take the amount of energy it does to contract a muscle? Why are our in other words, at a low level, why does exercise take energy, and how much energy does it take? Well, then you're going to give explanations in terms of quantum chemistry about the activation energies of those various reactions and things like that. So he thinks that physiologists in particular are going to work at all of these levels, and that the ability to give an explanation at these different levels of the same phenomenon, right? It's the same phenomenon, the same target phenomenon. Why did this muscle contract, or how does this organism move? And give a story at different levels is going to be really critical to what physiologists do. So it's really important to him that he thinks that we shouldn't give up so easily, as Potochnik says, and just say, well, it's just this interest that you happen to have, because he says, well, look, if these levels weren't kind of really present in the world, then what would justify physiologists saying that there are different levels of explanation of this same concept? It would just be like, well, we've divided these arbitrarily into levels, something like that. He says, no, like, look, in order to give explanations at various levels, that must be tracking onto reality, right? Why would we say that this is a good explanation if it doesn't reflect reality in some way? So just as we think that, if our story is that organisms move because they have muscles, well, there had better be muscles. That had better not just be in my head. If the muscles move because they have muscle fibers, well, there better be those fibers when we dissect them. Why should, those, if those are going to be given a story, a biochemical story, well, then, those molecules had better be present in those ratios when I do, analysis of those muscle fibers, etc. Our thinking had better reflect the world, he says, and that means not only the things itself that are out there, but also the way that they're structured, and so that should include our level structure. So he gives some ways of thinking about this. So he calls these compositional relations that form the levels. So one of them, so he gives some strictures or requirements for this. The first is that it should be a synchronous relation. The sus relata are spatially overlapping, right? So the whole muscle obviously spatially overlaps its fibers, its parts. The fibers of the muscle spatially overlap the biochemical, the biochemistry that makes up those fibers, you know, etc. The relata are involved in synchronous changes. So when the muscle contracts, its fibers move along each other. When the fibers move along each other, these biomolecules are activated, etc. So the changes are all synchronous. They're happening at the same speed at all the levels. The relata are supposed to be in some sense the same, they're not identical, right? So if I ask what's here, I could say a bunch of muscle fibers, or I could say a muscle. And those are not, in a way, different things to say, right? I don't count. It's not like if I'm weighing it, I weigh all the muscle fibers and then I weigh the muscle, right? Like they're, you know, somehow I would talk about the same thing, but somehow they're not identical because I have a different level of description involved. If I talk about a whole muscle, that's a singular. I'm not talking about all the fibers. That's a plural. And they're supposed to have what he calls natural internal relations. So if the entities on one side of this relation are found at a time and place under the right conditions, then you also have the entity on the other side. So if you have all the muscle fibers and not as stripped apart on your dissection table, but you know, as in the organism, well, then you also have a muscle. If you have a muscle, well, then you also have the fibers, right? You can't have the one without the other. And he says these form compositional levels when you have working individuals. So this is kind of the general part of composition, right? Composition kind of makes one out of many somehow. So you have many molecules, one fiber, many fibers, one muscle, many muscles, one organism. So you have a kind of an individual at each level. You're also supposed to have a terminal whole with activity closure. So for him, this is the whole organism. So the whole organism is somehow what acts upon the parts of that organism are the other parts of the organism. There's a kind of closure of its activity. And then also we're going to have activity closure within the relevant levels. So if I want to ask what acts on a muscle fiber, that answer is going to be in terms of other muscle fibers, another answer at that level, rather than an answer in terms of, well, this other muscle is acting on the fiber. No, I would say muscles act on muscles, right? When one pulls on one side of a joint and one pulls on the other side of a joint or something, or muscles act on tendons on these whole parts. If I want to zoom in, then I need to zoom in kind of on both sides, so to speak, and talk about parts acting on parts. So that's what he means by activity closure kind of within the levels. And this account has been persuasive, but the issue, I suppose, has been that it's obviously incredibly restricted, right? So this doesn't tell us anything about how to compare levels across individuals. So, you know, some kinds of animals are more complex than others, right? What should I compare a muscle to in this, you know, in another animal? So if I want to look at an amoeba moving, it doesn't have muscles, but it does move. It has a pseudopod, right? And it kind of walks, so to speak. What am I comparing to? Well, how does that work? Is the muscle at the same level as the organism, as the organelle in the amoeba? Well, but shouldn't the amoeba's organelles be at the same level as my organelles? He kind of can't give you any answer to that question. He also kind of excludes ecological wholes or even populations from counting as compositional levels, because he says they're not working individuals, they don't have activity closure, right? The various bits of a population might be quite distributed across a landscape and not interacting with each other. And so there you wouldn't have activity closure within a population of organisms. So you know, this is fine, and this has gotten some traction in the literature, but it's important to realize just how restricted it is and how little it delivers on this kind of original vision of levels, because it's never going to actually give you the elements of this picture. It can't do what Potochnik says and kind of tell you how the parts of this thing relate to the parts of that thing. And nor can it give you some of the most important levels that people want to talk about, such as saying that that psychology is a higher level than biology, or that populations are at a higher level than individuals, or anything like that biologists have done. So there's kind of an issue there. So one thing that kind of underlies this, an underlying point that we might worry about, is this question of whether levels are local or global. So sometimes people have kind of gone back to these kind of geological metaphors for levels or layers. And so just present there's two issues. So on the one on the left, the geological unconformity, which comes in various kinds, one of which is called a nonconformity. The lingo can be a little confusing, as in any discipline. But the issue here that we see is kind of maybe the sodium ion case, where a level that's normally distinguished by some intermediary in some cases doesn't have that intermediary, right? So the igneous or metamorphic rocks that are normally below, separated from higher levels by these kind of like more brick-looking ones, on the left side are not so separated anymore, right? That level kind of goes away, and they become an immediate part of the level above. So it's like that sodium ion that when it comes out of the cell, suddenly it's an immediate part of the organism and no longer mediated by some other level like cells. And then worse, we have the kind of geological fault case, right, where you have, obviously the geology case, you have a whole sliding fault such that things that might seem like they're at the same level because they're the same kind of rock with the same fossils in them or whatever, end up, well, very literally at different levels, right, at different depths on each side of the fault. And so that might be some case where, like, for instance, the organelles of the, or not the organelles, but the bits of the amoeba that are helping it move, they we might say, you know, biologists do say things like that. Oh, those are the kind of the muscles of the amoeba. Well, okay, because they perform a similar role for the amoeba that muscles do for us. But of course, but they're kind of going to be at different levels because they're not well, they're organelles, and you know, they wouldn't then map at the same level as our organelles because they would be kind of immediate parts, and our organelles are down within cells that are, you know, within the muscle fibers, within the muscles, etc. So you're going to have this kind of slippage where within different organisms, things that have a similar structure might really be at a different level of the organism. So how do we kind of make sense of this? So I want to kind of close by talking about my own proposal, which comes at the end of the paper. I'll kind of skip a lot of the metaphysics in this presentation, but I'm happy to talk about that if you have questions. So the idea here is to kind of that we want to track somehow parthood with our levels, but we need to do so in a way that gives us kind of consistent answers, which is what Potochnik was worried about. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few things we need to do to get this right. And so the idea here is to follow the priority things that are the priority relations that are found in the world. So we might think that while an organism, say, both has parts and also can be a part of a population, we might think that somehow the organism is more fundamental than the population or its parts. Why? Well, the parts of the organism develop precisely in accord with the organism's own genetic code, right? That drives the organization and development of those parts. Those parts are created by the organism's own metabolism that's bringing in the energy needed to build those parts biologically. So we might think that the organism is somehow more fundamental than its parts, but we might also think that the organism is somehow more fundamental than the population that it makes up. Why? Well, you know, a species is just a clade, right? It's just a specially marked out clade where it's the descendants of a particular, you know, individual. So if a species is really just a clade, then it seems like the existence of the individual, that first individual of the clade, is kind of more fundamental in a way than the species, because we're defining the species by picking out the initial individual of the clade. So we might think there that it's the individual, the organism, that's somehow being fundamental. So then what we have is what I'm you know, a discontinuity or an unconformity in the priority relations, right? Where 10 and 15 here are, say, organisms, so they are more fundamental than the whole they make up, that whole ecosystem 30. That's why I have those yellow arrows pointing up. They're also more fundamental, though, than their parts. That's why we have those yellow arrows pointing down. But in this approach, it does come with a cost, because we would need to say that certain relations can't happen. So here, you know, 2 we had as both a part of an organism and a part of the whole ecosystem at the same time, without, not as mediated by the organism, but directly. That's this arc. And we have to say that that's just not possible. So this approach would require us to make certain judgments that certain parthood relations just can't obtain in the world. But it would tell us to put all the organisms at the same level. And actually, interestingly, in this approach, it would also tell us to put the organisms at the same level as, say, free molecules in the environment. So just, an oxygen molecule that's in the air outside of any organism would be at the same level as the organisms. Why? Well, because it's going to make up something, right? Well, part of the atmosphere. So 6 maybe is the atmosphere. And 3 being an oxygen molecule makes up that atmosphere, but it's not part of any organism. So it's kind of an independent part of the world. And so until it's actually taken in by an organism in the process of respiration, it would be independent. So that's kind of the view that I hold. That does allow us to carve the world into levels that track parthood in a certain way via these priority relations. But it is, on the other hand, restrictive. It allows us to say that certain things are wholes that are all at the same level, and it allows us to say sometimes that they have parts which are at a different level, but it still doesn't necessarily allow us to do everything we wanted. It doesn't allow us to really compare the parts of different organisms. So I can't really say on this model what the parts of the amoeba correspond to in me. I would just have to say it's a different organism of a different type, and there's no direct way of doing that comparison. So some things would still end up being interest relative or representational in this model, but at least we can recover a lot of the basic structure that we wanted, of at least being able to talk about organisms, molecules, populations, the kinds of things that were in that original diagram. So that's my pitch, and I'm open for questions. Hope I didn't talk too long, but yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. I'm sure there will be questions. Who would like to start? Michal.
Hi. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I thought that actually it would be much more about metaphysics, so the underlying picture, and I quite like these conceptual questions. I was quite puzzled with this assumption that levels should somehow satisfy our expectations for explanations, and well, on one hand, and then some parthood intuitions. And it seems that the explanatory or explanations speak explanatory relations, and those might not be transitive, right? It's useless if you use all your account is based on some transitive relations, but parthood is transitive, right? So we need to have a really different concept of parthood.
I guess I don't see why it's bad if your explanations are transitive in that way. So again, think back to that physiological example of the muscle, right? So the idea would be precisely that I gave, if you ask how does the organism move, I said, well, this muscle pulls on, this tendon, and this muscle pulls on this tendon, and they're attached to the joint, and voila, look at my hand. But then you can just zoom in and say, well, what does muscle movement mean? Well, it means muscle fibers moving against each other, et cetera. So I don't know why we would be resistant to the idea that explanations are often transitive.
Well, I would say that there is a difference between your, let's say, metaphysical stance. So you might believe that parthood holds, right? But in the explanatory practice, you don't need to make explicit that this molecule is a part of the muscle and the muscle is a part of the organism, and you just pick specific parts. You might be entirely silent about. I mean, in the specific form of explanation. That this is what I mean.
Yeah,
you might still hold the metaphysical view that parthood holds, but on the explanatory side, making these or making reference on the what is part of what on every step is not contributing to understanding, to explaining, and so on, and many actually I would even claim that most of the explanations do not explicitly build the whole system bottom up, or I mean, whichever way you start.
Yeah. So I don't think the presumption would be that all explanations need to be somehow fit into the level scheme, right? We could maybe have many explanations that just don't make reference to that, and I think that's fine. The question would be whether there's some important class of explanations that do fit into some kind of levels, do kind of track parthood, that would allow us to build a level scheme. Because it seems like if there weren't some class of explanations that did that, then there would be no reason to have those diagrams in the books, right? Like the reason those diagrams are in the books presumably is because they're suggesting that there's some class of explanations that is tracked or is aided by thinking about parthood in this way. And that's kind of what I was trying to motivate in terms of the ecological examples early on. So if that's not the case, if there's no kind of delineable class of explanations that does refer to these parthood schemes, well, then Potochnik would be right that there's just no point to a levels concept. Just, throw it out, or at least don't take it very seriously. I'm kind of interested as a metaphysician in wondering what can be recovered of it, precisely because it seems like a lot of people do think that there's gain here, whether that's Gillett's work on physiology or the ecologists. They do think that this is something that they do want to preserve, and so I'm not a philosopher of biology, so I'm in a way ill-equipped to answer the question of how much work these are really doing in biology, or whether these are misguided, visions of the biology. But insofar as both a lot of biologists and a lot of philosophers of biology seem to appeal to them, I'm interested in the question of whether those appeals can be given a sensible reading in terms of the metaphysics, and I would like to think they can be. If they're just misguided as a matter of biology, well, then obviously that metaphysics would be kind of just if the biology were like this, then we should read this metaphysics, but it's not, so you shouldn't. And that kind of argument is certainly going to be available. But there's enough attestations out there that I think it's at least interesting to see what the metaphysics would look like if they're right, that there is some class of explanations that does track levels.
I don't know if I can have a very short follow-up, or I can ask later also if
go on, Michael.
Yeah, it seems that your conception of what are the things to be taken seriously metaphysically are also quite demanding. So, for instance, I don't see why I shouldn't take different overlapping classification of the world in any anti-realist way, right? I mean, the fact that if you are interested in literally furniture, you might have a different classification than if you are let's say biologist, and you pick only organisms. Like, what, why should I be less realist about furniture than, or I don't know. You are starting with this neo-Aristotelian, or your picture, if I got it correctly, requires this neo-Aristotelian way of splitting the world into non-overlapping parts, and then you deliver the story. But I can have different classifications, and I can be fully realist about them.
Well,
just
so independently of the particular neo-Aristotelian proposal, right? So there's the neo-Aristotelian proposal that I make, and then there's a much broader question of just realism and fundamentality. So, so sure, it's not the point. I don't suppose is that different classifications can't be real. I mean, surely they can be, but there's sort of additional question of fundamentality, and I mean, obviously, there's plenty of people who are kind of anti-realist about fundamentality. Maybe they would say that there's no kind of fundamental classificatory scheme. We just come with different classificatory schemes based on our interests, and we can say that those are real, but none is sort of more fundamental than the others. That's certainly a view many people have. But there are also quite a lot of philosophers, of course, who've come in with the opposite view, who want to say that there's something about our basic sciences, where they are giving us kind of access to fundamental reality, or at least reality that's more fundamental than the world of common sense, such that explanations should run from science to common sense rather than the other way around, right? So if I want to know why this table in front of me is hard, why my hand doesn't go through it, I want to give an explanation in terms of the electronegativity of the the surface of my hand and the table, such that my hand doesn't go through the table, right? So you have electron density and repulsion explanation, something like that, and I would want to say that that's the right direction of explanation, that there's something more fundamental about the physical explanation than about just the common sense, oh, it's hard or whatever. And I would want to give that explanation a certain direction. And so if you think that explanation should kind of come from the fundamental sciences, then we might want to ask which ones those are and what entities they think are in the world, such that those entities should be the basis of our explanations, rather than just whatever entities that we happen to kind of cook up conceptually, and that some entities might be fundamental and other entities might be kind of derived. There's nothing wrong with having a whole different conceptual classificatory schemes like furniture or whatever, but that if I ask what the word furniture means, I would want to kind of cash that out in terms of some object or how it works or why it has certain properties. I would in the end want to cash that out in the argot of some fundamental science, and that's not furniture science. So I realize not everyone wants to think that way, and if you don't, I certainly have not said anything in this paper that would convince you to take that kind of perspective. But what's interesting to me is that in this paper is to say, well, if you have these kind of fundamentalist, realist kind of views, which many philosophers of science, especially in physics, do, but also some philosophers of biology, certainly Gillett does, then can you kind of cook up a levels concept that would survive Potochnik's challenges, given that you have the desire to? If you don't have the desire to, then yeah, nothing I've said in this paper would probably give you that desire. That would be a whole different bit of work.
May I? So what to think about biology and physics? So if you are a biologist, you cannot, I think, avoid fixing your basic ontology or fundamental ontology without saying something about biological living organisms, right? That's your starting point. So
Yeah.
so it is probably on the foundation of biology as science. But if you're a physicist, that's not your basis, right? And so now the question is for you, what to think about biology and physics? Are they both on the somehow not in this pyramid, but on the foundational level of sciences, and they are just splitting the world differently and taking different things in as a fundamental and starting point in this level talk? And if so, you should be defending some kind of, I mean, it's not very clear. You should maybe accept
there are other chapters to
pluralism.
So the view I defend is sort of the neo-Aristotelian one, right? That we have these substances, and the substances are fundamental, and sometimes those substances are going to be biological, like an organism. Sometimes those substances, in the case of an oxygen molecule that's just free in the atmosphere, that's going to be a substance. If I have a cosmic ray, coming in at high speed from outer space, that's not part of any molecule or atom, I would say it's going to be a separate substance. And the view that I would defend is actually that physicists, properly speaking, study the objects of physics as separate substances and only offer models, and not directly speaking realistically when they're speaking about the parts of organisms. But that's the subject of chapter 4 of the dissertation. I know that exists. I mean, this is actually, I'm writing the introduction last. So chapter 4 exists. I'm happy to send it to you if you want, but that's really a separate argument from the one in this paper.
Okay, I will ask if there is space other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail.
Okay, let's move on to Raphael. Yes, thank you. That was really interesting. I was not aware of this renewed levels debate, and I'm just now, thanks to your talk and the paper, getting into it. So thank you. As a beginner, I wanted to ask you about the motivation for the debate from the point of view of the science. Now, maybe Mikhail's last or middle question already elicited what you had to say about this, and I don't want to prolong it, but perhaps you do have more to say about it. So you mentioned at the beginning a number of contexts in the sciences where levels talk at least occurs. Now, I have to admit that maybe during the first 5 minutes, I was not entirely teachable. So I have to ask again, could you maybe expand a bit on how you think that levels talk in the sciences motivates the kind of account that you are giving, if it does at all? Because, right, it's possible that scientists use this term levels, but that it really plays little role in anything that they, in any of their reasoning, their inferences, in what they consider a legitimate explanation or not. But you can also imagine a situation where the levels concept is actually very powerful and somebody would propose some explanation and people would say, stop, this explanation is at the wrong level. So forget about that. And then suddenly to justify this kind of response, you would presumably need a levels account. But you can also imagine a situation where people say, oh, at the level of this, I see it happening that way, at the level of that. Then you ask about levels and you find out that there's some notion, but you could probably do away with the word levels and there is not an underlying metaphysical account of levels that plays any significant part. So this is my question, right? The examples that you give, are they simply stressing that people use the word? Or is there some sense that the concept of levels really figures into the kind of reasoning that is going on and maybe puts constraints on that reasoning? So that, yes, that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, I like to think, I would like to think that it very much does put constraints. No, I mean, so of course we can always kind of zoom out and ask kind of deeper methodological questions, right? So in general, there's always going to be a kind of process of going from the kind of density of talk of science. So just, when I go on Google Scholar and search, levels, and look at biology papers, what's that whole corpus look like, right? And then you're going to have philosophers of science, philosophers of biology in particular, right, who are going to look at some of those and say, that's not really doing much work, or that work isn't even worth taking seriously, or whatever. And then you're going to have from there a metaphysician, maybe of a realist persuasion, who wants to come in third, right? You're already kind of tertiary to the process because you've got the scientist, and then you've got maybe the philosopher of biology, or the kind of systematician or textbook writer in biology who's trying to kind of systematize. And then you as the metaphysician kind of come in third or fourth in line and say, well, if you're right that this is systematically useful, which bits of what you think are systematically useful, or how much of what you think is systematically useful, can really be made fully coherent or rigorous in the metaphysics without kind of resulting in some contradiction somewhere. So in some way, I see myself kind of coming in, well, I'm the metaphysician here, right? So I'm kind of relying a lot on other people who are insisting that this is doing real work. But I do think they've got some compelling examples. So, I think Gillett, in terms of the physiology, he's got an important story to tell that, look, if you try to answer when you're giving these kind of causal mechanistic stories that we like to give in physiology, then the various bits of the mechanism somehow ought to all be at the same level. Like if I'm talking about why does a certain molecule have this shape, then the answer had better be in terms of other molecules in environment, and not just act as if there's like a muscle pushing on a molecule, because that just seems like a kind of an impossible causal story, given the radically different scales and the kinds of relevant tools that we could talk about. So somehow, as he has it in the explanations, that you know, you can give the explanation at many levels, and those are all fair game depending on what your interests are. So the question of which level you're focused on is absolutely interest dependent. But that your explanation had better be sort of like within one level if it's going to be a coherent explanation. You better be talking about parts that are the right scale to interact with each other, that have the right kind of properties to interact with each other, etc. And that kind of forces you into a leveled kind of story. I do think you see it in other ways too. I mean, I do think there's a reason why this is present in all of these, or maybe all is strong, but so high a proportion of these kind of introductory textbooks. You know, we want to, it seems important to tell students why biologists need to study chemistry, but chemists don't necessarily need to study biology. I mean, some of them might want to, depending on the applications of their chemistry, but there's no, again, I don't know exactly how it works in Geneva, but most places, it seems to me, there's no general requirement that for chemistry majors to take a biology course, but there is a general requirement for biology majors to take a chemistry course. Why is that? It seems to me that the natural answer is going to be in terms of levels, to say that biological organisms somehow are made up of chemical parts. They depend on the operation of those chemical parts. They depend on chemistry, but that chemistry is somehow operating at a lower level, where the explanations given within chemistry, properly speaking, are not biological ones, right? You're not going to give, if as the famous line goes, you know, evolution is kind of the key to everything in biology. When you're giving a chemical explanation, you know, evolution is not going to figure in, right? You're just going to give an explanation in terms of the particular properties this molecule has. Now, the molecule might itself be the result of evolution, but now you've kind of gone to the biological picture and you're not really giving a chemical explanation anymore. That would be the kind of story that I would tell, and I think that explains precisely why these diagrams are so prevalent. But again, I'm in a way poorly placed to ask just how seriously should we take this in the biology literature. People have different opinions on that. My take is sort of at the next question down. If you're a realist about these things, if you take them seriously, which at least many biologists and philosophers of biology do, what's the metaphysics that could make sense of it?
Well, thank you. The Gillet example is not yet entirely clear to me. So doesn't the answer to the question of whether it would be appropriate to say that a muscle can influence the shape of a protein simply depend on whether there is some kind of mechanism that would explain how a muscle would influence the shape of a protein? And it's somehow, right, purely an empirical question of what kinds of interactions there are in the world, and to impose some kind of prior levels-based restriction on what explanations would be adequate would seem a bit odd. Don't you think?
I don't think we should think of this as like a priori, right? So, I mean, it's absolutely based on what we discover about the world. I mean, all of these, I mean, the very notion of what, you know, a muscle is or what a protein is, I mean, these are obviously things that we, you know, discover in science, right? And then we discover the mechanisms that we have in science. So it's not, this is anything but kind of a priori work. These aren't kind of impositions we have kind of from metaphysics that are then going out and structuring, you know, and saying like, oh, you can't have this kind of explanation no matter what you find in biology or something. I mean, that would be crazy. But his point is that when you look at the biological explanations, the ones that actually exist, you know, according to our best science, what you see is that there is no way of specifying such mechanisms, and so that there is a kind of natural falling into levels precisely because the mechanisms that we understand work that way. So yeah, if the mechanisms were different, then the metaphysical account we give would be different. That seems like that's good, responsible, you know, naturalistic metaphysics. But that doesn't mean that they aren't a certain way, and therefore we shouldn't specify the metaphysics that way.
May I just one more follow-up? but isn't it just the problem of attaching something quite big to something quite small?
What do you mean?
I'm really saying I think I may not understand maybe I'll ask you for the literature reference so that I can go and read Gillett, but I may not understand the example well.
Okay. I mean, so you mean by quite big, quite small, you're just saying like, why bother with a bunch of metaphysics for just some claim about muscle movement? Is that the idea? Or
no, well, so it sounds to me as if, you're invoking levels here when I'm saying, well, so I'm not even clear on what the example is. So is the point that if you wanted, I mean, muscles, I was going to say muscles don't shape proteins, but I'm not even sure that this is true, right? The forces generated by muscles may well impact protein shape by, creating tension on them, by creating pressure in a compartment that then has an impact on the shape of the protein by changing ion concentrations that have an impact on the proteins. I realize you would now say, okay, so we've gone to a different level, but there's just, right, there's some measure of difficulty in how you can describe certain phenomena at different scales, which doesn't necessarily commit you to levels talk. But that aside, it's not clear to me what the example is, because I just did imagine a number of ways in which a muscle could somehow have causal relevance to protein shape.
yeah, Carl's claim is that to get
and I'm
meaningful
just curious, what
explanations-
is the detailed argument that you would always have to translate this into some more fine-grained account, and it would never be appropriate to say, because the muscle contracted these. I mean, muscle contraction, right, is a process of proteins changing shape.
Right.
And to, so what is the argument that it would be wrong to say that the overall process causes the change? I'm sorry, I don't want to take up time here. I'm just not clear on how it goes.
I think this is an important,
but maybe really
question.
a literature reference would be to Gillett. Would be
Yeah,
sufficient.
I mean, if I can give you, but this is like his passion project and his whole work. So if you just search Carl Gillett, Gillett, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff on this. And I couldn't really tell you necessarily where to start. There's just a lot. But yeah, no, I think this is an important question. It's worth talking about. So I guess in the case of Gillett's work, the claim would be precisely what you said. Well, of course, a muscle contracting is a set of proteins changing shape. That's the whole point of the levels, right? That we can kind of zoom in and we're telling the story at the new level, but it's somehow about the same process, or I mean, that he takes for granted. The question, as you say, is about whether we want to explain the change of shape of protein in terms of the muscle as a whole. And that's precisely where he would say that's kind of ill-specified and would not be accepted by the scientists in this literature. I'm not well equipped to say that. I'm not a philosopher of physiology of all things. He really has become not just a philosopher of biology, but a philosopher of physiology. And so that's an expertise that he has that I'm not well equipped to evaluate. But I do think there are other contexts that I know more about where it would be really important not to speak in that way. So for instance, just to look in general at the question of biological and chemical, or biological and physical processes. I think if you're the sort of person, and there are people like this, like Nancy Cartwright at Durham and stuff, but if you want to say that physical events have biological causes, then it seems like you got in a situation where you can't do physics without doing biology, right? Because you want to say, well, I mean, physics is the study of the causes of physical events. And if physical events have biological causes, then rather than thinking that I could like kind of have a well-specified physics and then say that, well, within certain regimes of that physics, in other words, certain you know, temperatures, certain gravity, you know, et cetera, you know, biology emerges, right? Biology, you know, they have the right conditions for biology to occur, and then we can give higher level explanations in terms of biology. You would actually need to have biology in order to have a complete physics, and that seems to me to result in a kind of so maybe first unacceptable to many scientists, but also just result in a very strange view of the world, where somehow even though physics obviously predates the existence of any biological organisms, and those organisms seemingly are constituted by the operation of physical you know, things moving according to physical laws, that somehow we would need the biology to complete the physics itself. That's something that I would find very strange. And I mean, there are people who have, again, like Nancy Cartwright, there are eminent people who have that kind of view. I don't want to, you know, be too, you know, dismissive, but I think it's an odd view that has some pretty big costs the more you think about it. So
let's take some more questions. Christian's next.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have maybe two related questions on the presentation. It's about Potochnik's problem with the, let's say, sodium element. As you nicely said, yeah, at time t1, it's within the cell, and then it goes out the cell at time t2. So how is this giving us a consistent picture? First of all, one could say there shouldn't be such a big problem with an entity moving from one level to another, because if this really would be a problem, there would just be one fundamental physical level. We wouldn't even talk about the chemical element sodium in the first place. And secondly, a bit inspired maybe now by Carl Gillett, what the sodium atom is causally doing at time t1 within the cell probably differs substantially what the sodium atom is doing at time t1, at t2 outside the cell. So if you don't focus on just the entity in your metaphysics, but let's say more causal role, even processes. Potochnik, I think you mentioned in your paper also in brackets that maybe you don't talk about entities but processes. Maybe you can still stick to this kind of consistent picture. So maybe you just, it's not really a question, just to develop this a little bit would be interesting for me.
yeah, thank you, Christian. No, I think you're exactly right. So I don't understand why Potochnik is so worried about the idea that some entity can kind of change levels. And in fact, in a way, that's what I tried to draw out with partly with the geological fault example of, you know, you have something where at one time, you know, these are clearly the same rock layer, right? They, you know, have the same sedimentation process, the same fossils, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, there's a kind of an earthquake, and, you know, the fault shears, and, you know, now it's down further. I mean, I just think, well, look, this is just, you know, this the fact of how geophysics works. I mean, this is just what happened. And so, just as you say, you know, the fact that the ion is moving around and playing different roles as it moves around, I don't really see why she's so worried about that. But I guess in fairness to her, the concern is just that a lot of maybe metaphysicians, or, you know, people kind of, you know, we metaphysicians, right? We kind of work at the, you know, 100,000 meter view of reality, you know, we're in some, you know, stratosphere balloon or something, you know, just kind of, or out in space, you know, observing through a telescope. And so sometimes we have a kind of strange view, or we can make generalizations that are not, you know, always appropriate. But she's worried that metaphysicians have often kind of spoken as if these levels are kind of fixed in this way, right? That somehow, again, or even to be fair to her, again, that for scientists, when you look at these kind of pyramids that people put in introductory textbooks, you know, they'll often say, again, the one I gave partly for reasons of visibility on the slide didn't have too many levels to it, but some of them have like 20 levels in them, and a lot of them will put, you know, biochemistry at a level below cellular biology, right? So they'll say, you know, there's biochemistry, and then there's, or even biochemistry, then molecular biology, then cellular biology, then physiology, right? You know, they'll kind of make those things at separate levels. And if if the sodium ion, you know, is a chemical reality, which surely it is, then you would say, well, then it should be down with the chemical stuff, which according to this account makes it part of and below, you know, the cellular biology. But well, look, sometimes it's not, right? So I think it's at least fair from her as a kind of challenge to what is our consistent story going to be about this. And I think that's what I'm trying to give is my account absolutely allows for just what you've said, right? That depending on what the level of interaction actually is, you can have the same entity operating at different levels. That I think is true. But you then have to give a kind of principled account of what those levels are if they're not bands of kinds of entities, right? Because a lot of the literature sort of assumes that levels are bands of types of entities, such that all organisms, all cells, you know, all you know, chemicals operate at a certain level. And so, yeah, just I think it's fair from her to say, well, if you're going to mess with that, then you got to give me some kind of consistent story of what you got instead. And I think a lot of people haven't done that. So that's part of the productive attempt of this paper is to meet that challenge and say, well, if we do think this is what's going on and we think that's not a problem, what's the consistent account of levels that we can give that allows for that?
Ivan?
Oh, yes, and thank you for your talk. That was very interesting. So assuming that I'm a realist about levels and given the diverse use of the notion of levels in science, why should we seek a unified account for the metaphysics of levels? Is this because you're interested in a particular metaphysical view about levels? That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, in a way, this the whole project of the dissertation was just to try to figure out how we could make sense of levels talk, given that it is in fact quite pervasive. I mean, part of the particular way that this chapter is written comes out to the course that Chris and Marcel taught in the fall, which I was, you know, lucky enough to sit in on. You know, that course on fundamentality and you know, reduction and stuff really you know, just brought out, I mean, those papers were just over and over and over, you know, making these kind of levels references. And so part of the particular way that the paper written and part of the kind of little literature that I run through the beginning came directly out of that course, and all the kind of seminal papers that we read in that course. But yeah, the overall project of the dissertation is just this is just precisely this question that, hey, look, people are all the time assuming that reality is structured into levels. It comes up in the way scientists actually practice, and sometimes the kinds of explanations that they'll you know, they'll want to think in or demand that people kind of, you know, focus their explanations in a certain way. It comes up in a ton of the philosophy of science literature. It comes up in the way that we teach our students. It comes up in the way that the very university is structured, I think, in terms of course requirements and, you know, the setup of the university. And so I think it was just this interesting case of you have this concept that seemed, you know, quite pervasive, really, all the way from the working science literature to the very organization of the university, and yet one that, you know, was under a lot of attack in philosophy of science and metaphysics circles. And so I wanted to try to see, well, you know, do we have to jettison this? Is this something that the attack is justified, and therefore, you know, to be serious, we should really actually rethink, you know, the requirements of the university and, you know, and all kinds of things, or should we go the other way around and say, well, actually, there is something that can be saved here? And so in the end, I've come to the conclusion that this can be saved in a consistent way. But I think yeah, to me, it was just an important question given the whole structuring of things.
Well, just a quick follow-up. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I understand the general motivation of the project, right? So
sorry, maybe I missed your particular question. I apologize.
So the take-home message, or one take-home message, I get from the talk is that a lot of these uses in science, right, are to a large extent pragmatic and instrumental. So to a large extent, it might be possible, and it's quite likely, that there is no deep metaphysics involved in this talking about levels, right, in science. So the question becomes whether there is a notion, a deep metaphysical notion, a coherent metaphysical notion of levels that we can save from these different diverse uses of the notion of levels, right? So then my question is, well, I mean, why we should, I really don't know if you're assuming this, but my question is, why should we assume that there is one monolithic, unified metaphysics of levels, as opposed to having perhaps different independent sort of metaphysics that grasp different notion of levels, perhaps in certain corners of the scientific literature, but not in all of them, right? Okay,
Yeah,
that's it.
no, that's a very important question. And in some way, that's precisely my disagreement with Potochnik, right? So, are these just sort of different independent, interest-dependent accounts depending on, what corner of the literature you're in, or is there kind of one fundamental or master account we should be focused on? So I think that, we see this basic phenomenon over and over in the running from science to philosophy of science to metaphysics. So, while there's still some metaphysicians out there who want to just kind of work from their armchair in total ignorance of what the scientists do, in Geneva, that kind of thing is unpopular, and I think rightly so, because after all, we rely on science to tell us about reality. We know that our common sense is often wrong, and so, it's important to kind of be corrected by the science. But at the same time, particularly when scientific concepts become important in the structuring of everyday reality, we kind of owe it to ourselves to figure out which scientific concept we want to draw on and how we want to draw on it. So, for instance, to take another example, time, right? So physics says quite a lot about time and how time works or doesn't work. And you might be tempted to say about time just what you said. Well, different, whether we're talking about astrophysics or we're talking about particle physics, maybe there's just different concepts of time going on, and who really cares? You can just let them all do their thing. And in some way, you can let them all do their thing. My project is not one of telling scientists, how they must talk. So I'm content to let the various scientists do their thing. But at the same time, if you want to say that time is somehow important to human experience, but that human experience is somehow generated in a result of physics, well, then you had better find some concept in physics of time that you can relate to the concept of time in your experience. Otherwise, what are you doing in using the same word? And I think we would say the same thing with levels here. So biologists presumably use levels talk in all kinds of different ways, some of which maybe are just kind of representational, interest dependent. But given the important structuring role that levels talk does, in the way we teach students about the relation of the various biological subdisciplines, or in the way that biology relates to other disciplines in the university, etc., it seems like we had better be able to take one of those bits of levels talk seriously enough to do that work. Otherwise, we're building on sand. And so my question is that even possible, I suppose, is the point of my project. So it's the point, especially in this chapter, is less to convince you that this is the right thing to do, especially if your priors are more pluralist or anti-realist than mine. I'm sure I'm not going to convince you of that, but at least to indicate whether it's possible, because Potochnik and others have mounted a really sustained criticism of even the possibility of that project. So I think that's an interesting question.
I have a question about your view, Ryan, and it concerns the non-overlapping of substances. So if I understand you correctly, a substance cannot have other substances as proper parts.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that in the context of biology, I find rather counterintuitive, because surely, if there are substances, then an individual organism is a substance. I mean, that's very plausible. But what about cells? I mean, cells that obviously compose organisms. cells have most of the features that the organism does. I mean, in particular, you know, the emergent property par excellence, the property of being alive and of being dead, can be predicated of cells as well as of whole organisms. I mean, the cell does most of the things that the organism does. It has homeostasis, it has reproduction, it has growth, metabolism, etc., etc. In fact, it makes sense to perhaps to say that the activities, the vital activities of the cells are more fundamental than those of the organism, because the organism essentially lets all the cells do the work and lets different cells do different work. Now, I find it strange to give the honorary title of substance, award the honorary title of substance to a whole organism, but not to a cell that makes up the organism. But it seems that your metaphysics will not allow this. And I'm not sure how much Aristotle knew about cells, but I'm not even sure if Aristotle would be would be happy with this.
Well, okay, so I'm gonna gesture an answer, but I don't promise that you'll find it convincing. So, or maybe even two kind of bits of an answer, which if you pull from different ends, maybe we can get them to meet in the middle, but I don't know if you'll find that or not. So first of all, in terms of Aristotle, I actually think Aristotle is while he didn't know anything about cells, I mean, he obviously did lots and lots of dissections and stuff, and had, I mean, he wrote the whole book, Parts of Animals, right? So it's not like he doesn't think that the parts of animals are important in explaining their functions and stuff. He surely does. And it's hard to know, of course, exactly how his view would have changed if he'd known about cells. I mean, just precisely for the reasons you say, the various characteristics he attributes to life, are so seemingly attributable to cells that it's hard to say what he would make of that. But I would suggest, as someone who did my first master's precisely on the interpretation of Aristotle, that he is really profoundly committed to this kind of principle, the non-overlap of substances, for all kinds of reasons that go well beyond this biology. And that if he were to change that, it's hard to see what there would be left. So, I mean, obviously, we've learned a lot since Aristotle's day. Aristotle's views are deeply empirically informed according to science as he understands it and as he is doing it. So perhaps that's the right answer. Perhaps it's the case that if he knew what we knew, he would come up with a whole different philosophy across the board. And Aristotelianism as we know it would just not be his view. That's certainly something you could defend. It's hard to know because you can't bring him here, but, it's not a crazy thing to think. But it's not, let's just at least say that it's not a small kind of modification. This goes right to the heart of Aristotelianism across a whole bunch of subjects, across the metaphysics, generation and corruption, the physics, the de anima, like just all over the place. And so this would not be a small tweak. Okay, having said that, to try to answer your question kind of directly. So you're absolutely right that my view is quite committed to the impossibility there, right? You have to identify the one or the other as a substance. I mean, it leaves open in a kind of an empirical element, right? So what do we want to consider a colony versus what do we want to consider an organism? And that's perhaps an empirical question that I'm not kind of prejudging philosophically. So maybe it will be the case, as sometimes happens, of course, that certain things that we thought were organisms based on our kind of immediate sense of their function turn out to be colonies or something like that. That's, certain Portuguese man of war or whatever, right? Things like that. Fine. I don't want to prejudge the science in that way, but it is certainly true that you ought to have one or the other on this picture. So one thing I can say in favor of that is, again, the project, especially the project in this chapter, really is to say, if you had realist ideas about levels, fundamental one, that this is like foundational, that levels are foundational to reality, what's the kind of most you could recover? What's the fewest bullets you could bite? And, given the alternatives, like say von Inwagen's view, which denies that there even are such things as molecules, or cells, right? Von Inwagen's view gets the metaphysics kind of logically consistent, but only at the cost of denying that there are any molecules or any cells. Well, you're biting a smaller bullet on my view, I take it, than that, right? I tell you that cells are not substances. He tells you there are no cells. Well, okay, if consistent metaphysics is important to you and you're committed to a view of levels, well, then at least you should like my view more than that one. Now, you might still just say, well, you might still say, well, just get me off the bus, right? That's fine. You're not as crazy as him, but you're still a nut, and this is just an untenable view. And I think that's I mean, I'm saying it that way, but I do think that's a respectable thing to say, right? Like, in some ways, I'm asking, especially in this chapter, how much sanity can be made of this view. And, that's an interesting question, I take it philosophically, even if you decide the answer is not enough for me. Or that, you're more comfortable, kind of biting the other bullet and saying, like Potochnik, no, just, it's not worth it. Just say levels are interest-based or relative and stop doing metaphysics and it's fine. Okay, that's the one answer. Just to say, well, you at least see how far we can go here. The other answer is just to say that, Aristotle and many introductory textbooks, give this definition of life in terms of, 6, 7 characteristics, which are kind of all treated as on a par, right? As you say, homeostasis and respiration and, whatever, right? We just say life has these 6 or 7 characteristics. But we already know that creates various problems. For instance, the status of viruses, right? Prions, things that seem to have one characteristic but not any of the others, or the question of how life began, right? Like, I'm not up on the current best views on this, but whether it's one RNA molecule replicating or whatever those theories are of the very first life. It seems like you have cases where not all of the criteria are met, right? So that somehow life would have to have evolved from non-life, in this kind of funny way. And literally, I mean the word evolve, right? Not just that life had predecessors in the world, which of course we take for granted. There was an Earth with no life, and then there was an Earth with life. It came from somewhere. But it seems funny to say that life evolved from non-life, which is what you would have to say if you say life has these 7 characteristics, but the first, but life is evolved from a single RNA molecule or a single protein, or whatever the story you want to tell about the origin of life is. So we already have some pressure against this sort of just take all of these criteria on a par kind of account. And I would suggest that the right way to go is to take evolution really as the central thing, and to take to kind of downgrade the others to either epistemic indicators of the presence of life, but not full metaphysical import, or to say that they're just results of evolution that, well, if you're going to be fit, you better maintain homeostasis, because otherwise, you're not going to be able to, continue to take in stuff and reproduce or whatever, right? To kind of put those as results of evolution rather than, par characteristics. So if we kind of take that suggestion that some biologists have made and say, no, we're really going to be serious here, like evolution is the key to everything in biology, then I think we would want to say that our substances in biology are precisely where the evolutionary bottlenecks occur. And so insofar as, the genetic bottleneck happens at the creation of the organism, that's what we should identify as our substances. That when we identify clades and species, right, we pick out a clade by the ancestor organism, not by an ancestor cell. Why do we do that? Well, because that's what makes sense in terms of evolution. And I would say evolution should be our surest guide in biology. So that's the other answer I would give that maybe would hone us to try to kind of, again, pull that to make my view a little more plausible. But I don't pretend that this is a cost-free view. You're still going to end up with like lots of cases where biology might seemingly give you a fuzzy answer. For instance, I mean, the question of the bottleneck, right? A bottleneck is not absolute. It's not there is a bottleneck or there is not, right? We talk about it's the width of the neck, and different cases in biology have different, neck widths, so to speak, right? Different cases where you go from a certain extreme, like in humans, to, in a sponge or something else, you have seemingly a less of an evolutionary bottleneck of going from organism to organism. So less of a genetic bottleneck. So in cases like that, you might say, well, it's even kind of fuzzier, whether it's the cells or the sponge that are the substance. And yet my metaphysics would demand that you choose, right? That you could even say epistemically we don't know which it is. That's fine on my view, but still my metaphysics would say there is an answer. And maybe you think, well, that's just kind of getting too out in front of the science. The science tells you there's not an answer. You say there is. What justifies this arrogance? And again, I would have to retreat to the other side and just say, well, this is the cost of the levels concept. Sure, any philosophical view is going to have bullets to bite. These are the ones I'm biting. I think this creates an interesting view. But if you think the other bullets are better to bite, then I can't really probably convince you out of that. Sorry, long answer, but trying to respond to an interesting question.
Yeah, no, it's obviously a very substantive answer to my question. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss it any further. And also, sorry to Sylvia, we are out of time. Maybe you can write your question to Ryan. So thanks a lot, Ryan, for joining us today from New York City.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for having me. Just to say, if anyone is really interested in this question of the fundamentality question, that's chapter 4 of the dissertation, and it exists. So if you want to read it, I'm happy to send it. I'm not asking anyone to do this, but just if you are interested, I do have a chapter on that question. So,
all right, great. So thanks a lot, Ryan, and the rest of you for joining us today, and enjoy the day. Thanks also to your baby for letting you finish your presentation today. Okay, bye everybody.
Thanks, take care.